For decades, saturated fat was labeled the ultimate dietary villain, blamed for heart disease, clogged arteries, and even impaired brain function. Public health campaigns, food labels, and nutritional guidelines warn consumers to avoid butter, red meat, cheese, and coconut oil, driving a massive shift toward low-fat, high-carb processed foods. But the tide is turning. New data are challenging long-held assumptions about saturated fat, revealing a far more complex and at times unsettling picture. The question now isn't whether saturated fat is dangerous, but whether it's been deeply misunderstood. Let's begin with the heart. The idea that saturated fat clogs arteries dates back to the mid-20th century, largely based on observational studies like the Seven Countries study. While influential, these studies were limited by poor controls, selective data, and a failure to distinguish between different types of saturated fats or dietary patterns. More recent, higher-quality meta-analyses have called these conclusions into question. Several large-scale reviews, including those published in the British Medical Journal and Annals of Internal Medicine, have found no consistent link between saturated fat intake and increased risk of heart disease or stroke in the general population. This doesn't mean saturated fat is harmless. Rather, its impact depends on what it's replacing in the diet. If saturated fat is swapped for refined carbohydrates, such as white bread, sugary snacks, or processed cereals, heart disease risk may actually increase. But if it replaces industrial seed oils like soybean or corn oil, or if it's part of a diet rich in vegetables, fiber, and omega-3s, the overall risk profile may be neutral or even favorable. Context, once again, is everything. The conversation becomes even more interesting and concerning when we shift to brain health. The brain is largely made of fat, and certain saturated fats are essential for building and maintaining the myelin sheath, which insulates neurons and ensures efficient communication. Very low-fat diets, particularly those lacking in saturated and monounsaturated fats, have been associated with poor cognitive performance, hormonal imbalances, and increased rates of depression and anxiety in some populations. In aging adults, inadequate fat intake, especially when paired with high sugar consumption, may accelerate neurodegenerative processes. In fact, some researchers now argue that demonizing saturated fat led people to replace nourishing, whole food fats like butter and cheese with heavily processed, low-fat products filled with sugar, starch, and artificial additives, foods that fuel inflammation, impair insulin sensitivity, and damage the brain over time. Ironically, the war on saturated fat may have contributed to the very diseases it sought to prevent. But there are warnings, and they are serious. Saturated fat is not a free pass to consume unlimited bacon, cream, or fast food burgers. The type of saturated fat matters. For instance, stearic acid, found in dark chocolate and beef, has neutral effects on cholesterol, while palmitic acid, found in processed meats and palm oil, may raise LDL cholesterol more aggressively when consumed in excess. The quality and source of the fat, grass-fed beef versus processed lunch meat, butter versus shelf-stable margarine, dramatically changes its health impact. Moreover, individual response varies. People with genetic lipid disorders, diabetes, or a strong family history of cardiovascular disease may still need to moderate saturated fat. And when saturated fat is consumed alongside a diet high in sugar, refined carbs, and ultra-processed food, as is common in Western eating patterns, it becomes far more damaging. This synergistic effect may drive systemic inflammation, a key player in both heart disease and cognitive decline. What's most important is the broader dietary context. A diet rich in whole, unprocessed foods, with a mix of saturated, monounsaturated, and polyunsaturated fats from sources like eggs, nuts, fish, olive oil, and yes, even some full-fat dairy, is far healthier than a low-fat diet built around processed, nutrient-poor carbohydrates. In short, saturated fat is neither a universal villain nor an unrestricted ally. The fear that once surrounded it has been exaggerated, and newer evidence suggests that it can play a role in a healthy diet when chosen wisely and consumed in moderation. The real danger isn't the saturated fat in a piece of grass-fed steak. It's the refined sugar, low-quality oils, and engineered junk food that now dominate modern diets. The time has come to stop blaming single nutrients and start focusing on the bigger picture: food quality, whole dietary patterns, and long-term metabolic health. Saturated fat deserves a reassessment, not a free pass, but certainly not the condemnation it's received for over half a century.